I want to spend a moment to talk now about mixing shellac and then filtering the shellac that you've mixed. Usually I use what's called a 2-pound cut, and that basically let's say a 1-pound cut would typically be comparable to 1 pound of shellac to 1 gallon of alcohol. So depending on how much liquid you end up wanting to create, you're going to use usually a lot less than that. There are guys who will measure it very meticulously on a scale. I'm not one of them. You can do that, certainly, nothing wrong with that. But there's a simple way. And what I do is I take my jar. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned, you're going to use glass jars for mixing and storing your shellac. Plastic doesn't cut it. Metal containers, no. So usually I use old spaghetti sauce jars. They're great. So anyway, when I put the flakes, this particular bag, you can see it's very well ground up, but often you will get large flakes. I typically will break them up as I put them in the jar. And let's say I put in an inch worth of flakes in the jar for the sake of argument. I then fill the jar with alcohol to that inch place so that the flakes are now just covered in alcohol. I then put in a comparable amount, in this case another inch of alcohol. That's a 2-pound cut, believe it or not, or at least it's close to a 2-pound cut. You then shake your jar periodically. Shellac should dissolve within 24 hours, often much less. I marked it on all my jars here. This one dissolved in 4 hours. This one took 6. A couple of these took only 1. In other words, very quickly. But 24, you should shake the jar periodically, and within 24 it certainly should dissolve. We're going to talk a little bit later about how to know if your shellac is still any good, and that's one of the ways to know if it's any good, if it's not dissolving very well. But we'll get to that later. So now you've mixed your shellac, and whether it's waxed or de-waxed shellac, you want to filter it. And what I do is take another jar. I use a painter's filter, and then I'll stuff the painter's filter with 1 or 2 coffee filters, and I will pour the shellac into the other jar. The reason is you have a lot of impurities in shellac. In the process, remember, the shellac it's a bug. It's the secretions of the lac bug. And so you will end up with little bits and pieces of bug, twigs, sticks, all kinds of impurities that will filter out when you use a very simple filter. As I think I said before, the de-waxed shellac will typically have 1% or less of wax left in it. You'll also be able to filter out a small amount of that wax, as with your simple filter. Now let's say you've made waxed shellac. There's a few ways that you can filter out the wax. One is exactly the way that I just talked about. You use a funnel or a painter's funnel. You put, perhaps in that case, a couple of coffee filters in, and you pour your shellac into it. And you may have to do this 2 or 3 times, but you'll get a good layer of wax that will remain behind in the filter. So that's probably the easiest way. Another way that I've heard people do is they'll take those coffee filters, they'll bundle up 2 or 3 coffee filters, they'll put the shellac flakes in the filter, they'll tie up the filters, and then they'll literally drop it in the jar with the appropriate amount of alcohol and let the alcohol dissolve the shellac flakes that way. The third way, probably my least favorite, but I've done it, is you let the shellac, not that one, it's de-waxed, but you let the shellac sit for a week or so, and the wax will settle to the bottom. You then decant the good clear material, leaving the wax behind. I haven't had good success with that technique. The wax just tends to get decanted as well as the clear stuff, but I know people who do it that way. Okay, we're filtering over here. It's very exciting. This is the TN. There's another way to filter, especially if it's wax shellac, and that is with what's called a Buchner funnel. It's used in chemistry. You line it with filter paper that you can buy to match the size of the funnel. I guess you could use coffee filters as well, but in the case of the Buchner, the advantage of it is you get special made papers. They're not very expensive, but they're more expensive than coffee filters, and you can funnel through this. It's pretty effective as well. So that is one other method, particularly for the wax, for the de-waxing. But again, even the coffee filter, let's see, is doing a good job of slowly filtering the material. I put in 2 coffee filters into my funnel. It's just a very high-tech process, I know, but with the waxed stuff, I'll probably end up doing this 2 or 3 times, back and forth. The other issue about wax is, excuse me, when it comes to French polishing, a little wax content, you don't have to be too anally meticulous. You're going to get some of the wax out this way, but you're not going to get it down to a 1% wax content. It's okay. Now, on the other hand, if you're using shellac as a base coat and you're putting another finishing product over the shellac, at that point I'd probably use de-waxed shellac and have it with the smallest amount of wax content. But for our purposes, where essentially in French polishing we're melding one coat to the next to the next to the next of shellac, again, I think you're okay with this sort of methodology in terms of taking the wax out. Now, why do it at all? There's 5 or 6 flavors of de-waxed shellac that you can readily buy, and for many people that is absolutely enough. But at a certain point, you'll want to experiment with other colors and other types of shellac to see what kind of effects and colors that you get. And at that point, you'll probably want to try the waxed flavors of shellac and filter them in this manner.